Okay, I'm not going to give a general presentation today about climate change and everything from A to Z. I've been asked to do something much more specific, which is to talk about climate emergency, what is safe. I know there's been a lot of discussion about the 1.5 degree target from the IPCC. How relevant is that? Or this discussion about have we got 10 or 11 years before we're all doomed? And is the end nigh? So that's the brief I've been given. So this is fairly specific. And the first question is the obvious one. We know our goal in climate work is for the maximum protection of the people, societies and natures. We don't trade off and say, yes, we'll agree to this amount of warming because 10 countries will drown, but the 180 will not. That's not what we do. We say, what is the maximum protection? So the first question is, what is a safe climate goal? Where do we want the climate to be? And you can all mentally in your head put a number down in your heads now, and I'll check back in a couple of minutes about what you think the right number is. So let's start and think about this. So we know that the climate warming so far is about 1.1 degrees compared to pre-industrial, the end of the 19th century. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution, back to the mid to 1750, there's about another 0.2 or 3, which is a contentious issue, but the normal nomenclature is the end of the 19th century. So we know that the last 10,000 years, the years of what is known as the Holocene of human civilization defined by fixed settlement, the temperatures have been between 0 and 0.5 degrees warmer than the end of the 19th century, because the early Holocene was a little bit warmer than the recent one. We've now got to 1.1, and we know we have already passed significant system tipping points, including for corals. I mean, there's now clear evidence that coral reefs will essentially be gone at around the current warming because they're likely to bleach every 3 to 4 years and they take 10 or 15 years to recover, and that's a death spiral. We know that Arctic sea ice that floats on the northern polar region is collapsing towards zero in summer. And we know from work that scientists published in 2014 that the conditions have already been set up in the West Antarctic ice sheet for the loss of a significant amount of ice in that ice sheet without any further perturbations or warming of the system. So we have already passed tipping points, which sort of suggests at 1 degree is not a great target, even though we're there. Of course, we now have evidence coming out that the Greenland ice sheet is also getting into this range of maybe flipping. We know that there will be many more sea level rises as we go up through the scale. So even by 1.5 degrees, we will probably have lost the West Antarctic and the Greenland ice sheets, which between them is more than 10 metres of sea level rise. In the end, might take a couple of centuries, 3 centuries, we don't know exactly. And that is enough, of course, to drown most of the world's cities, which are on coasts. It's also enough to inundate the world's river deltas, rich river deltas, which are prime agricultural land. I mean, think of the Mekong, think of the lower Ganges. Anywhere in the world, it is those river deltas that are core to our food production. And of course, once we get up from 1.5 to 2 degrees, James Hansen, the great American climate scientist, has said that 2 degrees is a recipe for disaster. And remember, that was a climate policy making target for a long time, a recipe for disaster. And last year, some of the world's leading climate scientists, including Will Steffen from Australia, came out with a paper which was the most downloaded scientific paper in history. And it was called a Hothouse Earth paper. And in it they said, not only is there the warming we see very quickly, but there are elements of the climate system which can flip to releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. I mean, you know about the permafrost. For example, also the Amazon rainforest, soils, plants, trees, oceans being less capable of holding carbon. So even if we don't put up more fossil fuels, these systems themselves will push the warming up. And that was their theory, that was their explanation. They said this could be as low at 2 degrees, perhaps even a little bit lower. So let's go back to the question of what is safe. I won't ask you if anybody wrote 1.5 on the back of their hand, but in my view is very simple, that 1.5 and 1 are not really what the world to be. So why do we have a fetish about 1.5? Well, because policymakers have decided to talk about 1.5. But policymakers are not necessarily rooted in the science of the world. So my only conclusion is that a safe climate is the stable climate of the last 10,000 years on which we have evolved our cities and our coastal lifestyle. I cannot see that staying even here at 1 degree, losing the world's coral reefs, producing a 10-metre sea level rise is something that we want to aim for. Now, is that impossible? Well, we have to make hard choices about how quickly we can stop this and get carbon out of the atmosphere, and I'll come back to that. So, I've been asked to talk about the 1.5 degree report, which came out last year from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, about 1.5. Let me just start with a little background. We produced, as Jane said, a report last year called What Lies Beneath, subtitled The Underestimation of Existential Climate Risk. That underestimation done by groups like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I'll come back in a moment to talk about why they underestimated. Those reports have a one-sided reliance on climate models. Those models underestimate certain processes which are relevant, what are called the non-linear processes, the things that don't grow up gradually with warming but tend to jump from one state to another. They also tend to exclude or downplay our understandings from climate history, called paleoclimatology. They exclude expert opinion, and they exclude what are called more observation-based models. As a consequence of that, the IPCC reports have been tragically conservative on a whole lot of issues. In 2007, their report said that Arctic sea ice would be projected to disappear by the end of the 21st century. At the end of that year, so much of the ice melted that one scientist said, oh, it's melting 100 years ahead of schedule. The scientists were behind schedule. The science wasn't ahead of the science. And we've now lost by volume 70% of sea ice in the last 30 years. If we come to permafrost, the loss of carbon from the permafrost is basically excluded from IPCC reports in toto. It is not talked about. And yet we know that in the next 10 years that feedback will start to become active. Some scientists think that around 1.5 degrees might be the point when that kicks in. So while it hasn't kicked in yet, it will certainly be material relevant. Every scientist in the world will say to you, the permafrost feedback is not zero. But the IPCC reports basically have assumed that it is. And then we come to Antarctic, which I talked about, where the 2001 report said there would be no significant ice mass loss this century. And even the last report said the contribution from West Antarctic would not exceed several tenths of a metre, this much. And yet we had a number of peer-reviewed reports since 2014 that says that ice sheet sector is already likely destabilised. No further acceleration in warming is necessary to keep it going, and it could trigger 3 to 5 metres of sea level rise in the next 2 centuries. So there's this gap between what is said in a politically mediated report and the reality. And the same with sea levels. It's happened time and time again, where the IPCC has said sea level rise is half a metre by 2100, maybe a bit more, but we're not looking at some things. Yet even the American military, hardly revolutionaries in this area, have 2 scenarios for sea level rise when they're thinking about their bases, 1 metre and 2 metres. So the US Defence Department has got 3 times the sea level rise of the IPCC. I mean, this is disturbing. And there's a paper came out last week saying we've got to look at 2 to 3 metres, peer-reviewed this century. So it keeps on going up. So we have this consistent reticence. And then we come to the IPCC 1.5 degree report that came out last year, for which there was a lot of publicity. And it also is conservative for a number of reasons. The first of all is it doesn't account for all the warming that has already occurred. It starts into the 19th century rather than when we started burning fossil fuels. It underestimates the likely future rate of warming. It assumes it will be 0.2 degrees per decade. I'll show you in a moment something that says it's going to be 0.3. It once again excludes those sort of climate system feedbacks, the permafrost and so on that I've talked about. And it really downplays the economic cost, because it was not only about the science, it was also about the impacts at 1.5 and 2 degrees. And it really, I think, downplayed the economic and social consequences of 1.5 and 2 degrees. So that report said that we could get to 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2050. Their midpoint was 2040. And because that was, in 2018, was 12 years away, there was some reporting done which said, oh, we've got 12 years till the end of the world or till disaster strikes, or 12 years to do something, which is not what the report said. The report said we may be at 1.5 degrees by 2030. They're not the same statements. So Kate Marvel from NASA says 12 years isn't a deadline. Climate isn't something where we go along, fall off a cliff, and that's it. The impacts ramp up with the temperature. There's not a golden year. She said, we don't have 12 years to prevent climate change. We have no time. This is the most important statement. We have no time. It's already here, and even under a business as usual scenario, the world isn't going to exactly end in 12 years. So we should simply stop talking about 11 years and 12 years. It's a complete distraction. And here's Gavin Smith, who's now the head of space studies for NASA. The thing to push back against is the implicit framing that there is some magical global mean temperature number that separates fine from catastrophic. Or 1.4 okay, 1.6 terrible. These are 2028 okay, 2032 no good. This is a false and dangerous construction of the thing. Just as a side point, the IPCC report on the black line suggested a certain level of warming, but if you actually just run the current climate models out, the red line, it comes up with something bigger. So whereas the IPCC said we get to 1.5 by 2040, I can quote you half a dozen peer-reviewed papers say it'll be 2030. And that's where I believe we're heading. So we're going to put on perhaps another 0.3 or 0.4 degrees of warming in the next 11 or 12 years. How do we get this disjuncture in these IPCC reports? I think this is really important to understand that these reports are what an academic called regulatory science, as opposed to research science. And what she meant by that, she said it was co-produced. She said these are reports of science that straddles the dividing line between science and policy. So in the work of the IPCC, there's always a policy bird sitting there going, click, click, click. They can't handle some of this stuff. Let's just tone this back a bit. Let it sound reasonable. Let's assume that business as usual can solve this. And Kate Dooley, who has been doing work at University of Melbourne, says, in things like the IPCC, science is neither an objective truth nor only driven by social interests, politics, but is being co-produced through the interaction of natural and social orders. So these IPCC reports are a synthesis of science and politics. And I think that's really important to understand and not to take them uncritically. Okay, let's go on. So a couple of years ago, we wrote a report saying that climate risk and threat was now existential, which wasn't a word that people had been using a lot. And by existential, we mean a threat that is both global in scope and terminal in intensity. That is a risk posing a permanent negative consequences to humanity that may never be undone, or not for a long, long, long time. And we know this because after the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, some voluntary commitments were made by nations. But those commitments, if they're not improved upon, will take the world to more than 3 degrees of warming. They are manifestly inadequate. And that 3 degrees does not include any of the system feedbacks. So if you include all the system feedbacks, that 3 degrees, including some people at MIT, is closer to 5 degrees. So I think we have to say, if on the present path of Paris, without improvements to those commitments, the world is headed towards 3 to 5 degrees of climate warming. That's the bitter reality. And 4 degrees, Kevin Anderson from the UK, who some of you may have seen, says 4 degrees is incompatible with the maintenance of an organised global community, likely to be beyond adaptation and not stable. Even the World Bank says there's no certainty that adaptation to a 4-degree world is possible. I mean, in fact, a 3-degree world is pretty nasty too. We have just released a report available on the Breakthrough website on climate and security risks with a scenario for 3 degrees, which a whole lot of American security analysts concluded 10 years ago that 3 degrees would, quote unquote, lead to outright chaos in the relations between nations. So that's where we're going. Just by way of comparison to the IPCC, the best source of knowledge about where the climate's going is where it's come from. Because you don't have to run models and make assumptions, you just go and look. You go and dig and search and research, and you find it. And from that we learn that each 1 degree of sea level rise will in the end, and it might be several hundred years or more, will lead to 10 to 20 metres of sea level rise. In the last ice age, things were 4 degrees cooler and the sea levels were down 100 metres because all the ice was stacked up. We also know that 35 or 40 million years ago, when it was about 4 degrees warmer, there was no ice on the poles and the sea levels were 70 metres higher. So there's roughly 4 degrees is roughly 70, 80 metres of sea level rise, either way. That takes time, but when they say, 1 degree, the sea level rise might be half to 1 metre, that's on a very limited time frame. And the last time, and this is really important, the last time we had the current level of greenhouse gases in the Pliocene 3 or 4 million years ago, the Earth was 3.5 degrees warmer and sea levels were 25 to 40 metres higher. Now, it takes time once you've got that level of carbon dioxide for the system to wind through and get to that, but we have to understand that the current level of greenhouse gases of carbon dioxide is enough to produce a world like that. So, in summary, 0.5 degrees is safe, 1.1 is already dangerous, 1.5 has more significant tipping points, 2 degrees maybe the hothouse Earth tipping points threshold, 3 degrees is outright chaos, 4 degrees is incompatible with a global organised community, and our policymakers international have set us on a path of 3 to 5. So that's the problem. So the big questions, how soon do we have to get to 0? And is it too late? Because I know a lot of people are depressed and think it's all going to end in 10 years and doom, and do we all become preppers or something else? So let me answer the first one, and Kate Marvel in that quote has already answered it that I highlighted before. How fast to 0 emissions? The evidence-based answer is yesterday or the day before. Every time somebody says to you, how fast to 0, you just say yesterday. Because it's the truth and it just shifts them. Not in thinking, how many more birthdays am I going to have, but how old was I yesterday? The practical answer is as fast as possible. And there can be no too fast, as fast as possible. Long-term targets produce complacency. Short-term targets are dependent on the capacity to mobilise the global economy to solve the problem. This is the one slide to burn into your consciousness when people say, how long have we got to last? Say this, it was yesterday, as fast as possible, and the fastest we can get there is by mobilising. Now, you know the sort of solutions we have to this. The first is to stop producing carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases. The second is to cut what are called the short-lived pollutants, particularly things like methane. Whereas carbon dioxide effectively has an atmospheric lifetime of 100 to 1,000 years, methane has 10 years. So if you can stop producing or cut down methane, it will come out of the atmosphere much more quickly. So it provides you a more short-term capacity for easing some of the warming. Then there is, of course, carbon drawdown, whether that be reforestation, getting wetlands back into the shape they should have been in, using restorative agricultural processes or technologies which have not been developed to get the stuff out of the air because there's too many blankets on the bed and we're all cooking. And lastly, do we need options to cool the planet if we're about to flip through some systems from which we won't recover? So there are the 4 levers. So when people say, can we get there? this point, and it was made by Paul Gilding in his book, The Great Disruption, I think is really important. And that is that disruption is inevitable. We are exceeding planetary limits already. I mean, this goes back to limits to growth. The physical resource use is unsustainable. Every year we use what is a year's worth of resources by September, and then it'll be August, and soon it'll be May or something, which leads to a path of overshoot and collapse. That is well known. This frame is bad for some because there's going to have to be creative destruction and a lot of stranded assets, which we're starting to see in coal companies, and particularly in the US, going broke. This can't be resolved without large-scale disruption, because either we continue on the current path, which is disruptive, because the system will crash, or we have to mobilise really quickly and have a disruptive economic change, a rebuilding of our productive capacity. So there's no happy, smiley, business as usual, easy way out of this. And that's the delusion of policy making. We all go along, back onto carbon tax, everything will be all right. We are way beyond that in terms of the time we have to deal with the issue. So we're now in a new policy paradigm beyond the Paris-style talks. It's too late for gradual incremental steps. I mean, that policy-making process has been going on for almost 3 decades, and emissions are 50% higher each year than when it started, and they haven't tipped down. This is now a planetary emergency which requires leadership and an unprecedented response in peacetime. When you're about to go off a cliff, you just don't need to slow your speed. You actually need to reverse out. It's not just slowly changing things. You've got to do a U-turn and go the other way really quick. So Will Stephan, a climate counsellor and very senior Australian climate scientist last year, said that getting greenhouse gases down fast has to be, and these words are really important, the primary target of policy and economics with something like a wartime footing. This is a former advisor to the Labor government, 2007-13, saying climate has got to be the primary target of policy with something like a wartime footing. How fast can we move? Well, as fast as we want to, in a way. We have the economic capacity to address, look, I mean, we spent 20 trillion on the GFC, keeping banks alive. I mean, George Monbiot said it'd be sad if we could save the banks but not the planet. We have the economic capacity. We have many of the solutions. I mean, renewables are now just wiping out fossil fuel energy systems because they're cheaper. It's not primarily an economic or a technical issue, it's a political, cultural and social issue. And the community, I think, increasingly in the last couple of years, we're seeing a real change in climate politics, away from the old climate policy making to things like the Green New Deal, the school strikes, Greta, the climate emergency mobilisation, XR, a new, I think, honesty about the problem and what's got to be done. How fast can we move? I know war's not a great analogy, but here's a little table of the proportion of economies that were spent on the war between 1939 and 1944. So in 1943, the United States spent 42% of its economy on the war. In the UK it was 55%, in Germany it was 70%, and Japan it was 43%. So in Germany, 2/3 of production was for the war effort. I mean, we can't put 1%, 2% of our production into climate solutions at the moment. I mean, this is insane. And my proposition is if we move this fast to build a machine to kill people, why can't we move this fast to address the climate crisis so it doesn't kill a lot more? And that's the question I think you should put to politicians. Why are you so keen to build capacity to kill people and not to stop them getting killed? So the big question in the end, because I think the community is really ready for this, is whether the other side, capital, will act and respond to this, because they're sitting there waiting to see what the game is at the moment. Will they act in time? I don't know. What can force them to act? Well, to some extent, we can force them to act. I think it will also require a fundamental split or an economic war between old and new economies, old and new capital, which is what you're seeing a bit at the moment. When you see a lot of the new tech and renewable energy entrepreneurs really getting stuck into the deniers in the Liberal Party on Twitter in a very public fashion. I mean, that's just an expression of that war. Most importantly, it will require defeat of the neoliberal orthodoxy that markets can solve everything. If you look at any rapid transition, whether it's the Japanese economy in the 50s and 60s, whether it was what happened in China after the last 30 years, you look at the war economy, rapid transitions are characterised by planning and coordination by the state, because it can do the things and make the decisions that the market is simply too slow or not competent to make. If we do what I just talked about, we'll get out of this. I have no doubt. But I think we need to be aware of people who are becoming over-apocalyptic about this. Because the ones that I've seen, and I won't name them, I think are not scientifically literate or consistent. They'll say, oh, it's all doom, all gone, all bad. But maybe we'll get out of it. Within 2 pages. That's not a consistent position. That's really not helpful. I think a lot of the preaching apocalypse reflects a personal despair at times. Things like telling people to put their money under the bed and store some food is naive and silly. It's not serious. If you want to go into survival mode, the 3 things you need are community, tools and knowledge. Not money, which will devalue and become worthless, and a few tins which will rust. Sorry. If we're going to have a serious discussion about survivalism, let's have a serious one, but not this stuff. And if you truly believe that the end is near and there's nothing you can do about it, don't go and bloody whisper in the ears of people who want to do things, because it just disables them. I'm sorry, it's just not helpful. I was on the platform a couple of years ago with somebody on a debate, and they said to me, you know, we're all fucked and there's nothing we can do about it. Not quietly, and I turned to them and said, well, why are you on this platform? And it's a really serious question. If you think that, just go and shut up, because you're not helping anybody else. You're really not. And don't foster the illusion that survivalist prepper outposts are a realistic strategy for humanity's future, because they're not. Of course, if we keep on going down the current path, this will become existential, and human civilization as we know it will come to an end. There's no doubt about that. Even 3 degrees could be chaotic. But an existential threat to human civilization is not the same as an existential threat to human species. Some countries, particularly poorer countries, those in the tropical zone where deadly heat will get them, in the subtropical zone where we'll get drying and drought, will be more vulnerable than those closer to the poles. That's just the science of climate change. So don't confuse threats to human civilization in the current order to meaning that every human's going to die. Not the same thing. And lastly, and I should have said this at the beginning, I don't think we should ever believe the science, but we actually need to spend the time to understand it. Because people feed all sorts of versions of the science to you. You actually need to bring a bit of a critical mind to understanding this stuff, because you can be led in all sorts of directions. And there's no need to overblow it, because it's brutal enough as it is. Thanks very much. Well, I mean, I did talk about the fact that disruption was inevitable, because we know from limits to growth and so on that we are now using the world's resources at a rate that is unsustainable, and we will get overshoot and collapse of an economic character. I mean, even without climate change, that scenario is there. So you're absolutely correct that the world teeters on the financial system breakdown all the time. I mean, the fact, you know, for the last few years in Europe, you've had to pay money. You've had to pay the bank to put money. You've had negative interest rates. I mean, that is a sign of a system that's seriously at war with itself. So I have no doubt that that's the case. Until the system collapses, it hasn't. And until it collapses, I'll be here trying to get it to do things so it doesn't collapse. Because the other logic is yours, and I don't think that leads many people into a good place. I think it leads them into a really dark place. We have got 10 years to really, truly turn this around. If I was giving this presentation in another 10 years, I wouldn't be here, because there'd be no point. Seriously. Pardon? No? no, 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 no. I'll deal with that when we get there. Not much point, being sleepless for the next 10 years thinking about it. Sorry if that's happening to you. I mean, there are many issues. There are extinction issues, there are social issues, there's race issues, there's justice issues, there's climate issues. All I can say is that if we don't solve the climate issue, all those other things will simply be irrelevant because there won't be an organised society here to deal with them. That's not to put them off and say they're irrelevant, but my feeling, this is the number one issue. This is the issue that determines whether the other issues are relevant. And so I think we have to defer a whole lot of really important ideological issues about, are we going to bring down capitalism? I mean, I've said to people, if we're, given the state of the left at the moment, if we're going to bring down capitalism as a precondition for solving the climate problem, I think we're in a lot of trouble. You think about civil society, the community, capital, and the political class. The political class don't lead very often. I mean, they basically administer on behalf of the business class. And occasionally, they wobble, but leadership in the end has to come from capital. If they don't crack and go to war with themselves, the political class is not going to do something that they think is completely not in their interest. I'm sorry. Power resides with capital, not with the political class. Okay, so markets are miscalculating risk. That's the problem. They think they're being rational in calculating risk, but they're actually investing in doing things that will destroy their market in the future. So there's a contradiction within their own behaviour. I think a crunch is beginning to come within capital itself. I mean, you're now getting a debate about risk coming out of England and Europe in particular, about the risk of lending to certain sorts of industries. It's even coming here. It seems a bit esoteric about, the risk of business of doing certain things. And I think that is starting to make a change. Look, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know whether they're going to do it or not. I don't. Sometimes I think, that a few of them will wake up one morning and understand that their own grandchildren might burn in hell if they keep on behaving the way they will. Will that moral imperative change them? I don't know. I mean, I think we have to understand that we have opportunities, we have the space to turn this around. We need capital to go to war with itself. Yeah, time is running against us. The sooner we get to this moment of reckoning, the better, in terms of understanding what we need to do. Now, what will bring that on? Is it a crash? Not necessarily. If the extreme weather events that had hit the Mexico coast and wiped out a poor city had actually hit New York instead, if Superstorm Sandy had been another 2 metres higher, then we might be having a different conversation. I mean, it's when rich, affluent societies get hit full on that I think this is sad but true, that the more likely we'll have this conversation. I mean, let me give you an example. China's great export zone is on the Pearl River Delta, just opposite Hong Kong. That is constructed on alluvial soils which are sinking, which are 1 to 2 metres above sea level. If if Cyclone Haiyan, which hit the Philippines, had hit that area instead and wiped out a lot of China's export production, the Chinese, the Australian, and the world economies would have been in recession, if not something worse, almost immediately. I mean, this system is now really vulnerable. On the other hand, if you could imagine, and maybe this is a fantasy, that you had a Labor Party or a party that lost election, a new leader came on and the leader said, I'm actually less worried about winning the next election than just going full bore and having an honest conversation with Australians about this problem and what we did about it. What if a Labor leader every day got up and had this conversation we're doing? It would be transformative. Because it would open the window wide to discussions, and not even allowed now. I mean, The ABC won't hardly talk about climate change anymore, they're so scared. I mean, we have to open the public space, and the political class have got a responsibility in this. So have public intellectuals who've basically gone missing in action. I mean, a few writers and musicians are doing more than the whole of the intellectual class on these issues. So, I mean, I don't think we can blame individuals for their modes of behaviour and response in the absence of an appropriate social and political context. All these policy-making processes are constructed to contain things within a business as usual, reform as usual paradigm. That's what it's all about. I mean, Sir Nicholas Stern and Ross Garnaut both brought out reports on what we should do. And they both said, oh, we should go for this was 10 years ago, we should go for 2 degrees of warming, or we could go to 3, and 2 would be better, but we think that would be too disruptive to business, so let's go for 3. I mean, that's a paradigm. So obviously those processes are no longer useful. I mean, the UNFCCC and the IPCC as they currently exist don't have any useful function as far as I'm concerned. The fundamental point about any transition is it will not happen when there's a strictly partisan rule in society. It actually requires the whole of society to want to do it. I mean, you talked about the war economy. I mean, one of the really interesting things about that process was that studies done in Britain and Australia showed that ordinary people were prepared to sacrifice and go without things and have rationing and so on because they thought the war was 2 things. It was fair, the rationing was fair and necessary. It was for a good cause. And until we have that same understanding with climate change, it's not about us sacrificing, it's about the top end of town leading the sacrifice, carrying the flag first. But until people understand that climate change will require a social collective fairness, that's the humanities issue, and sacrifice, things will not change. The US government does a thing called the National Climate Assessment every 4 years, and its reports are much stronger than the IPCC reports. I mean, if you got all the climate-related agencies in Australia, the Bureau of Meteorology, the CSIRO, our Antarctic Division, and a reasonable government gave them a mandate to give us a report on what's going to happen in Australia, it would be a reasonable document. If you said, this is not for policy purposes, just give us the science. In terms of your more substantial question, I mean, there's a lot of work being done about how climate change unfolds. I mean, we did a report on its threat to what people call national security, I call human security. I mean, we already know that things like the war in Syria have a climate driver, as do the war across the Sahel, Darfur and so on. So these are existing events, not future possibilities. Conflict, social breakdown, regional conflict are driven by the things they've always been driven by, lack of food and water. That's where conflict generally starts. And we know that climate change will have those effects. I mean, in China and India, there are already severe water crises and overuse of water. As soon as you get monsoon shifting from one part of a country to another, which is happening in Pakistan. I mean, there are predictions at 3 degrees that a lot of the monsoons in China will simply not be there anymore. You get the melting of the Himalayas, so then there's not as much meltwater each year. So you get the food and water issue, which is going to be most extreme in poor countries because they simply don't have the capacity, the economic capacity and resilience to deal with it. Another sort of driver is extreme heat. So there's some work being done where you get the sort of heat where you simply cannot live without air conditioning. I mean, anybody who's ever been to the Gulf, Abu Dhabi or Dubai knows what that's like. Inland Australia for parts of the year. At around 4 degrees of warming, most of the tropical zone is not livable for substantial parts of the year without an air conditioner. So that is another great driver. With global warming, rains which used to drop on the temperate zones get pushed towards the poles a bit more. So the semi-tropical zones will dry out, which is why you're seeing the Sahara starting to jump the Mediterranean into southern Europe, you know, the fires in Greece, the drying of southern Spain. So there are a whole lot of processes that were happening of range shifting, of extreme heat, because civilization and settlement and growing food has occurred where the water is. And if the water shifts, there'll be more water because a hotter atmosphere holds more moisture. But if the rainfall shifts to where humans aren't, then you've got a problem. So the big issue, knowing all these components of what a hotter world looks like, is trying to put them together into an integrated picture. Well, I mean, it's always been fairly obvious that one way to tell a story about climate change is to link extreme events to the future and say these are previews of the future, which they are. I mean, it was interesting in the Townsville floods, which we had last year. If you watch the news, one night they said, oh, this is very serious. The next night they said, oh, we think it's a 1 in 100-year event. The following night they said, oh, it's a 1 in a 500-year event. And then the third night they said, oh, it's an unprecedented event. So you can see it ratcheting up. I mean, I think it's really important saying these extreme events, the fires we see, I mean, what's happened in the US, I mean, you know, Hollywood almost burnt down, this sort of thing, is to say these are previews of the future. So we actually absolutely have to link extreme events. And I think one of the reasons, and all the polls show this in Australia and internationally, that concern about climate change is really up. I mean, we even have polls in Australia showing the majority of people think we're in a climate emergency, which would be unbelievable figures 2 years ago. So I think the increasing frequency and severity of extreme climate events is leading to an increased understanding. There's some other work being done by Rebecca Huntley, who wrote about it in a recent quarterly essay. She's a qualitative researcher, you know, the sort of person who goes around and sits in people's living rooms and talks about what's going on. And she said that about a year to 2 years ago, she sensed a change in her qualitative research, that suddenly people had an anxiety or a worry about climate change they didn't have before. So I think that the existential nature, the idea of this threat being there and being more imminent and closer and more personal than before is already kicking in. She has this wonderful section up the back about climate change, in which she says she sensed this increasing sort of anxiety and concern, and things had changed in the last 18 months. And in that, she actually advocated sort of a climate emergency, wartime mobilisation, which is pretty amazing by a social researcher in a quarterly essay that she said these things. And she went on to say, and this is where I got it from, she said, my impression in her talking to people, that's what she does for a living, she says, my impression is that people are prepared to make some sacrifices, but only if they see the top end of town doing it too. I mean, we see that in some polling that was done by the Australia Institute. They indirectly asked a question about whether they thought climate change was important, and there was a question about whether they accepted that the action would actually cost them something. And the majority said yes, and that was okay. So I think we are moving on in that discussion a little bit as well. If you look at what's happening in the United States with, for example, the Green New Deal, which is sort of a radical plan for a government plan to restructure the economy, it's actually rating not badly with Republican supporters because it's talking about rebuilding an economy, not just about climate change. And I think there's some clues in that. I think transition is a bit of a soft word that's probably been around for too long. I mean, clearly climate is an emergency. The system will be disrupted, there will be breakdown. I mean, we're getting climate breakdown now. If you look at Syria, for example, I mean, I think you cannot solve a problem, you cannot give an answer without describing the problem as it is. You know, to have an answer, you've got to ask what the problem is. And if you can't describe the problem in its full form, you won't get the right answer. You'll get a Mickey Mouse one. So I think we have to be really honest and brutal about the problem, and then find a way of describing the answers and the processes that have meaning and people can subscribe to. I mean, that's what the health promotion smoking people do. You'll die if you do this, you'll live longer. You know, we can't be soft on the problem. How we describe it, I mean, I think, as I said, I think there's some learnings in the Green New Deal stuff, which is trying to talk about the solution in a whole of society term, not just you know, this is agriculture policy or this is an energy policy, but Green New Deal is saying this is a deal to rebuild the economy of the society because what we have now is not working. So I think there's something in that means it's been quite popular and it's sort of zipped around the globe and become a bit of a meme. Why has Green New Deal become a meme when transformation and transition, a whole lot of other things don't? I mean, I don't know the answer, but I think that's an important question.